Hey everybody, welcome back to Truth Revealed. I'm Sergio Denaro. Today we are on episode 2, the final episode of analyzing Karen Reed's responses in 2 separate interviews. We're mixing the 2 interviews together. The 2 interviews that we're looking at are the one from Nightline in 2023, from before her trial, and the one that was on Boston 25 after her trial was over. The benefit of being able to look at 2 separate interviews simultaneously is that I get to show you a continuity in her answers. Now, before we get into the analysis, I want to refresh your memory on something that we talked about in the first episode, which is that there are 3 parts to every question answer situation that we're looking at. First is the question itself. We want to look at the verbiage of the question because the verbiage matters. The way that a question is asked is going to elicit a certain response. And so we want to analyze the response, which is the second part, based on what's being asked in the question. Now, the third thing that we want to keep in mind is what are we ultimately trying to learn here? In this case, it's whether Karen Reed murdered John O'Keefe. So every question is going to ask for a certain piece of information. That piece of information may or may not directly correlate back to part 3, which is we're trying to learn whether or not Karen Reed killed John O'Keefe. So when somebody asks a question like, there's a lot of negative press about you, do you read that on a daily basis? If we see deception in her answer there, that doesn't tell us anything about whether or not she murdered John O'Keefe. It gives us information. It might help us to interpret an answer that we see later on. But in and of itself, even if she's deceptive there, it's not going to tell us whether or not she had any involvement in John O'Keefe's murder. Every single question, we have to keep in mind, what is it asking? And are we learning anything directly pertaining to the information that we're trying to find out? Now, the second thing I want to address here is the question of, am I biased? I get that question a lot, and I want to try to explain my feelings on this. If it comes across in the video like I'm moving towards either guilty or not guilty, it's because I've already done the analysis. I already know how this ends. I know that to you as the viewer, you're learning this as you go, and if I'm pushing you in a certain direction, it feels like bias. But I've already done the analysis. I know, like I said, I know how this ends. So if I'm trying to show you that one answer to a question means a certain thing, when that seems hazy to you, like, does it really mean that? It's because I've already looked at everything else and put this puzzle piece into context. Let me answer this question now from a different way. I'm not going to tell you that I'm not biased on anything. But I will tell you that when it comes to murder trials, celebrities, anybody that I don't know, I couldn't care less whether they're guilty or innocent. I really don't care. And that's not going to be the case every time. I've told you this before in a different video, but when I was growing up, I loved football, and John Elway was my childhood hero. Now, if as an adult, if John Elway got arrested for something, I would make the decision of whether or not I wanted to analyze his statement or not. Because if it's something that is minor, then that wouldn't affect my view of him in the long term, I would analyze it. And if it was something that if it was an outcome I didn't like, I just wouldn't make a video on it. If it was something big, if it was a murder trial, I probably wouldn't even look at it because I don't want to know. Because I know it would tarnish that childhood memory. And so that's how I deal with bias. When I started this case, the only thing that I had to go by was Karen Reed's first interview, which shows deception, and what the Commonwealth was putting out in the media. And so I went into this with an assumption that Karen Reed was guilty. That didn't influence at all my analysis. In the end, I'm just an analyst doing a job here. In the end, I haven't done my job if every single answer doesn't lead to the same conclusion. If I can't show you that, then I haven't done my job. And the reason that I was looking at this for a good 3 weeks before I started to go through my process of creating these episodes is because there was one question that was out of place. There was one piece that didn't make sense. And I couldn't go into this with one piece out of place because if everything doesn't make sense, then I don't know what's out of place. So I had to work that out. Once I found that missing piece and put it into the puzzle and everything fit together, at that point, I was ready to go. And so to answer the question of bias, most people have bias, and it's not for a good reason. But my answer to doing that is simply, if I'm personally invested in the outcome of what I'm telling you, then I simply won't do it. I either won't do it or I won't record it. So, with that being said, I want to talk a little bit about your opinions on the case. Are you biased? There's something called confirmation bias. People have a tendency to formulate a black and white opinion. That's propagated through watching movies, reading books. We tend to like to have a good guy and a bad guy, and we want everything to be clear cut. The good guy is always working for the benefit of the good, and the bad guy always has nefarious intent. Real life just doesn't work that way. Most people are not 100% good or 100% evil. And while, of course, there are some, every time I say people are this way or people are that way, I'm talking about a bell curve, within one standard deviation to the left or right. The majority of people are going to fit into that middle area where, yeah, sometimes they do things that are selfish and sometimes those things hurt other people. And sometimes they do things that are selfless and whatever. You get this mix of things that come across good and bad, and most situations just don't end up all black and white. So it's important to keep that in mind. Just because Karen Reed lied in a certain area doesn't mean that she committed a murder unless she lied about committing the murder. So keep that in mind. The last thing I want to say on that is I'm going to challenge you today to put any preconceived ideas aside, at least for the sake of this video. Put those ideas aside and keep your mind open to what I'm going to show you today, because you will have a clear understanding of every moment that transpired through this entire event. It's when you hold on to a belief that is based solely on an opinion, then when other people present evidence or information that contradicts your opinion, you end up with what's called cognitive dissonance, and you're trying to rationalize away information that doesn't jive with what you think. If you pay attention through this whole video about everything that we talk about, in the end, nobody will be able to present any information to you that will be contradictory. They will either be presenting information that clearly is wrong or is something that you already knew, because we're looking at everything here. All right, with that being said, let's just get started on the analysis here. Now, we ended the first episode with a question. I showed you that question. That question is a very controversial question, and we're not going to start with that in this video because it's out of sequence and there's no question that prompted the response there. And so in order to understand the response, we need a little bit more context. So we'll analyze her response to that question, but it's going to be a couple questions in here. It's not going to be the first one. So to start this out, we're going to look at this answer. Now, this answer doesn't have a question. This is from the 2023 interview. And the best I can tell is the question has something to do with what happened that night. And we get a little bit of a narrative from Karen Reed. The one thing that I do know for certain is that this answer has to be in past tense or it's not coming from memory.
So I pull at the foot of the driveway. It's snowing. John has no coat on. It's windy. So I drop him off. He goes up the driveway and approaches the side door. And as I see him approach the door, I look down at my phone.
So you're looking for I, you're looking for past tense, you're looking for active voice. If you don't get those three things, then the subject's response is not coming from their memory. And so let's analyze this. So I pull at the foot of the driveway. She purposefully left off the ED. So I pulled up at the foot of the driveway. I pull in. It's tough to say, but because she cut it off. And when somebody cuts something off, it's because the right way to say it isn't right in their mind. And so we start off right off the bat with this wrong tense, but it's technically not correct grammar. So I pull at the foot of the driveway. It's snowing. Now, whenever something is contracted, we got to pay attention because this could be it is snowing or it was snowing. People don't usually contract it was. Usually it is the contraction here. So we need to keep going to see if we have more indicators, because it's alone, we don't know what that means. Even though she says it's snowing, it's hard to think that could be it was, but let's keep going. John has no coat on. It's windy, so I dropped him off. All right, at this point, we know that she's in present tense here. I pull at the front of the driveway. It is snowing. It's snowing. John has no coat on. It's windy, so I drop him off. He goes, that should be he went, up the driveway and approaches instead of approached the side door. And as I see him approach the door, I look down at my phone. None of this is past tense. This is all fabricated. If you're a strong supporter of Karen Reed, there's something that you're going to have to come to terms with right here. Now I'm going to start pulling information from previous questions. Having done the first one already, the first video here, and you already have a lot of the information, so I'm going to start pulling things together for you. Karen Reed stated that the biggest mistake that she made that night was drinking. Okay, we saw that in a previous question. something cannot be the biggest mistake that you made or the worst decision unless it has consequences. There had to be some sort of outcome to the drinking specifically that made it problematic. So to assume that she considers the worst decision that she made to be drinking because she had a hangover the next day is just being naive on our part. There has to be a reason for that. Now, this question about what happened that night shows me that she has to make something up here because she doesn't remember it very clearly. That links together with the drinking. So what I think is the reality of Karen Reed's situation here is that, and this is based on my own experience, if you've ever drank alcohol, then you can probably relate to this. If you go out and just having a good time with friends or whatever, you might have a few drinks here, a few drinks there. We do have another question actually from this interview where he asks her how many drinks she had that night. And this is very hostile, the exchange between the two of them on this question.
Walked out of the bar. How many drinks had you had?
I had probably about 4.
The Commonwealth says that you had 9 drinks that night. That's what the prosecution says.
I don't believe they're saying I wasn't in my right mind.
No, they were saying you were intoxicated.
Two of them on this question. And she says, I think about 4, something like that. It's very clear that she's underestimating. And he says, well, the Commonwealth says it was 9. And she doesn't disagree with him on that. She says, well, they didn't say that I wasn't in my right mind. So the combination of the information that we get is that by the time the night was winding down, the last thing that happened that evening was Karen pulled up in her SUV. Now, putting myself in that situation, I can imagine, okay, if I had 9 drinks, I'm going to tell you, I'm not a lightweight, but 9 drinks is a lot. Even 4 drinks would be, but the fact that that was her biggest regret, that that was the worst decision that she made that night, tells me that she had had too much to drink, which means at the point where it's the end of the night and she's sitting in a warm SUV, just sitting there, and it's starting to snow, the snow dampens the sound, it is going to be hard to stay awake. So as she's in this state of the end of the drinking, end of the night, I'm not saying she passed out, but I mean, obviously she drove home. But once you start getting close to that point, you get super sleepy. And the reality is your perception in your world gets about this big. Like, it's hard to take in all of the information that's around you. It's the biggest reason why you shouldn't drive, because you don't know what's going on anywhere around you except for the 2 inches on the road in front of you that you're looking at. So I don't think she has any memory of this time. Maybe it's hazy, obviously. I'm not saying she blacked out, but the fact that there's no commitment to what she says here tells me that she doesn't have real memory of this. She is telling you what she thinks you want to hear. And that's always what it means when somebody's speaking in present tense, when they're telling you about a memory of the past. I'm just putting all of this into context for you. How did she get to that point? Why is she fabricating a story right here? Now, if you're thinking, no, I don't think that's right, well, keep watching, because every other question is going to fit right in line with this one. So let's look at the points that she touches on here. She says, it's windy, so I drop him off. He goes up the driveway. He approaches the side. She's telling you the things that are most likely what happened. And then she says, I look down at my phone. She's trying to give you an excuse, a reason that is something that everyone does. And I'm not saying that she didn't do that. This very well might be completely accurate. She just doesn't know if it's accurate, is what I'm telling you. So that's why it's in present tense. So all of this, we don't really get a whole lot from this other than she probably doesn't remember this that well. Okay, the next question that I want to look at here is this question.
Fighter said that you said, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him.
I said I hit him. It was preceded by a did and proceeded by a question mark. What I thought could have happened was that did I incapacitate him unwittingly somehow, and then in his drunkenness passed out?
Question. So the question was, firefighters said that you said, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. And Karen Reed says, I said I hit him. It was preceded by a did and proceeded by a question mark. There's technically nothing in there that is deceptive as far as verbiage. Now, I'm going to address her tone because that is probably what is hung up in your mind. When you see this, she has a very angry and aggressive tone. And I want to explain to you how anger fits in when you're talking to a subject or when you are the subject into your answers here. Okay, so let's talk about the anger thing in a minute. let's look at the rest of this question first. What I thought could have happened was that, did I incapacitate him unwittingly? So now she's in past tense, which is correct because she is, in this interview, she's remembering what she said to the firefighters, which was the day after. What she said at that moment was a memory of the night before. So we're doing some inception here, okay? We're going, this is a memory of a memory here. And then what I thought could have happened was that, did I incapacitate him unwittingly? She's telling you that in the memory of the memory, she was speculating. That's in present tense, she was speculating. So did I incapacitate him unwittingly? Now, the problematic part of her answer here is the end, because she didn't need to put that on. She had already answered the question here. The problem is she is thinking in present time, sitting there answering the question. She's thinking, if I say what I thought could have happened was, did I incapacitate him unwittingly? She thinks that people are going to hear that and take that as a confession. Well, what I thought was I incapacitated him unwittingly. So in order to try to not make that sound like a confession, she adds in, then in his drunkenness passed out. Now, it's important to keep in mind that this is not a confession. She is not telling you here that she did that. She's telling you the reason why she said this. She's telling you that she thought that that was a possibility. The fact that she thought that it was a possibility does not make it true. It simply means that she thought that. So the important thing that I have to stress here is that we are talking about an incident that is very different than a premeditated murder. If I'm on trial for, let's say, the road rage incident, and somebody cuts me off, and I get out of my car and I shoot them in the head, there's no possibility that I didn't know what I was doing, or that I don't remember doing that, or that I did something that led to that person's death that I'm unaware of. People who are going to say, oh no, this is a confession, they are linking what she's saying here to like shooting somebody in the head. And that is absolutely not what happened. So it is possible. In fact, the most likely scenario here is if she hit him, she probably wouldn't have known that she hit him. So now what she's doing is telling you what her thought process was. The thing that you have to keep in mind is that her thought process has nothing to do with reality, unless she remembers killing him, in which case you would get indicators of deception that indicate that she remembers killing him. What you're getting here are indicators that she doesn't remember killing him, but she's actually not saying that it's not possible. So she was thinking at that time, did I hit him? Because she doesn't know. And that's all she's telling you. And then in his drunkenness passed out. So because what she's talking about, she realizes that people who want to interpret this as, well, you knew what you were doing, you shot him in the head. People that want to make that direct link are going to do that. And so she tries to add in information that would make it look like it wasn't her fault, that he was too drunk and he passed out. So she was trying to mitigate the culpability there. And then she also didn't want to blame John O'Keefe directly because she doesn't feel like it would have been his fault. And so she leaves the he off of passed out. And then in his drunkenness, he passed out. If she thought that was what actually happened, she would have used he. But because she doesn't think that's what actually happened, that he just passed out there, then she can't blame him. So by removing the he, it helps remove that element of blame. And she's not going to blame him because she doesn't think that it was his fault. Okay, so what does that tell us? Actually, exactly what she says. She says that she thought at that time that that could have been what happened. So that's what we need to take away from this. She thought that she might have hit him at that time, but that's what she says. This deception here doesn't make what she was truthful about more nefarious. It simply reaffirms her humanity in the way that she feels about having to tell you the truth about this. So we'll move to the next one. Oh, nope. Before we want to talk about anger. In dealing with deception, people will always follow this pattern. So when it comes to anger in deception or truthfulness, anger is either an indicator of truthfulness or an indicator of deception, depending on how it manifests. A guilty person knows that they have committed the crime, and the idea of the crime is not new to them. They've been thinking about it since they committed the crime. So the first time that they get accused of this crime, they're going to have a prepared response. And anger seems like it should be the right response. So you will often see a guilty person on the first accusation come back angry. Why would you even accuse me of that? And that anger, again, it's there because it's not a surprise to them. An innocent person is going to first be taken aback by the accusation because it's going to be the first time they've ever heard of it. And most people will think you're joking. So you'll have a bit of deer in headlights look, and then you should get a direct response right back. Let me tell you a story, a true story from my life. When I was working my way through college, I was catching shoplifters. I worked for a company that was hired by grocery stores to send us loss prevention into the grocery stores to catch people who were stealing alcohol or cigarettes. Keep in mind, this was 25 years ago. So, those things were out open on the shelves. Cigarettes were out on the shelves back then. And one day before I went to my shift, there was two owners of the company. And one of them called me and said to come to his house. So I went to his house, knocked on the door. He opened the door and I saw the other owner was in there with him. They told me to come in, sit down at their dining room table there. So I sat down at the head of the dining room table and they're like, do you know why you're here? And I said, well, I have the highest stats of all of the employees. So am I going to get a raise? Something like that. I can't remember exactly what I said. And then they said, $10,000 has gone missing from what I can't remember, the front office or some area in one of the stores that company was sending employees to. And they followed that up immediately with the accusation. And they said, we know that you stole that $10,000. We want to know why you stole it, or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it was. I was dumbfounded. I was sitting there thinking, what? So I can't remember exactly what I said, exactly what the first words out of my mouth were, but I smiled. It was something like, are you joking or are you serious? Something like that. And they got mad and they said, this is not a laughing matter. This is not funny. You're going to go to jail. You're going to be arrested for this. And I said, I didn't take your money. I didn't take the money, whatever. I can't remember exactly what I said, but they continued to very aggressively say that I was going to go to jail, that they already knew that I took the money, that I wasn't there because they were trying to figure out who did it. They already knew that I did it. And after about the third accusation, I started to get angry. And by the fourth or fifth time, I was yelling. And I mean, I was 20 years old. So I wasn't about to be accused of doing something that I didn't do. And, I thought I had that feeling like, you're not going to question my integrity. You're not going to question it. And I got angry and they kept saying, you're obviously guilty. Look how angry you are. No innocent person would be angry. And finally I was like, fuck you guys. I quit. And I started walking towards the door and they told me, no, wait. We don't really know who did this. We're trying to figure out who did it. We just wanted to see what your response would be. But the fact that you got this angry makes you one of our primary suspects here. And I left. So thinking back on that, people have I'm sure you have some similar story. Everyone has to have a time in their life when they were accused of doing something they didn't do. And you remember getting angry. And that's why when you do something wrong and you're thinking about it for a while, a couple of days later, when you get accused of it, you think anger is the right response because innocent people don't like to be accused of doing something that they didn't do. But in reality, an innocent person has an escalation of anger. It happens quickly, but the very first accusation should be some stunned, sort of glossy-eyed look, and then you should get a very truthful, direct, I didn't take that money. I didn't do that, whatever the response is there. And then you keep accusing them and they get angry. So that is what we want to keep in mind here. That story is the long way of getting about answering one of the questions that you might have here, which is it possible that an innocent person could be that angry? Because Karen Reed is clearly angry. And the answer is, yeah, if this isn't the first time she's been accused, then you're going to see that anger. If it's the first time that she's accused, you should not see that anger. Now, this is where not having all of the questions, when they edit it and they don't say the question right before the answer, and they don't put their own questions in order. So I don't know at what point in the interview they asked this question. That was the question that they led the news story with, but that doesn't mean that was the first question. They can't possibly have sat down and before they introduced themselves said, did you murder him? Like, there's going to be an intro lead into that, and they don't show any of that. But all of the questions that he asks her are very aggressive in that first interview. And so if that was even the second or third question that he asked her, and it was the other questions were asked in that hostile, they were asked how they were asked, they were hostile, then you're going to see an escalation in anger from her. So to see that anger here, because I don't know the order of the interview, I can't tell you definitively that it wasn't the first question asked in the interview, but there are going to be other indicators that we're going to see in a minute that's going to show you that this was escalating. So I'll show you that in a second. This next question is again from the 2023 interview. And that's pertinent because now we have a reason to be looking at which questions are from that interview, because we know that there's an escalation in hostility in that interview. So here's the question and answer.
Is it possible that you might have hit him unwittingly in your admittedly very large SUV?
No, not possible.
All right. So the question is it possible that you might have hit him unwittingly in your admittedly very large SUV? And Karen Reed says, no, not possible. All right. So that answer is direct, but it's terse. It's too direct. It's shorter and more direct than her typical way of answering. And she leaves off the it's. So she doesn't say, no, it's not possible. She says, no, not possible. Now, what does that tell us? When she leaves off the it's, it means that she doesn't believe what she's saying. It means that she has no commitment to what she's saying. So when she says, no, not possible, in her mind, she's telling you it is possible. It's possible. She's not saying that she hit him, because the question doesn't say, did you hit him? The question says, is it possible that you might have hit him unwittingly in your admittedly very large SUV? Now, let's think back. We just looked at a question that said the first thing she was thinking was, did I hit him unwittingly in my SUV? So you already know she was thinking that. So the fact that he asked this question here and you get the response says, no, not possible, and she's not sure of that, it is possible. You know it's possible because she already said that in the answer before. So here's an example of how you have deception, but what does it really tell you? Is this an admission of guilt? No. She's saying that it's possible, but all that does is it relies on her perception of that time, which we already know she was drunk. And so her perception of what happened that night is very sketchy. So let's keep going. Next question.
On the morning of January 29th, 2022, you said it was possible you might have hit John. How could that even be in the realm if you saw him going into the house?
Because it never crossed my mind that the people we were with, middle-aged adults with children, some of the children were with us that night at the bar. It did not cross my mind for several days that they did this to John, that John was treated like a piece of garbage. These were women and men, some I knew better than others, that I knew to be normal people. And I went through every possibility. He was near the road and he was dying. And I didn't think he was purposely put in that place.
Now, I think you can probably see why I put these questions in this order. Even though these aren't in chronological order, you're getting a progression of the storyline here. So on the morning of January 29th, you said it was possible that you might have hit John. Okay, well, that again reaffirms what we just looked at in the previous question. How could that even be? And she says, because that means this is sensitive. Obviously, this is going to be sensitive to her. Now, technically, she doesn't follow that with a negative. She actually inserts the word never here. So never is often a problematic word. I want to scrutinize her use of never here because it never crossed my mind that people we were with, okay, let's look at this. The use of the word never here. Never is often an exaggeration, even in its best forms. So we want to ask ourselves a couple of questions. Number one, is it connected to the word would? It is not here. So the next question we want to ask is the time period that she's talking about finite? Or is she implying that this is something that could never happen? And in here, she's saying, it never crossed my mind that the people that we were with, so it's a finite period of time. So use of the word never here actually prevents her from having to put a explanatory statement next to a negative, which would be an indicator of deception. So the use of the word never here is technically okay, and it actually makes sense. There's not very many times when the use of the word never makes sense as the best word for that situation. But in this case, it actually prevents her from having to combine an explanatory and a negative. So I'm just going to write this off as it doesn't mean anything here because it never crossed my mind that the people that's an indicator of closeness between Karen Reed and John O'Keefe in this moment. Let's go back and look at the question real quick. On the morning of January 29th, you said it was possible that you might have hit John. So this is, again, this is a memory of a memory. So this is on the morning. She's remembering back to that night. That night is the time of the murder. So I would not expect to see a we here. I would expect, it would never have crossed my mind that the people that John and I were with, that would have been very easy for her to say and put a little bit of separation in there, but she doesn't. And use of the word we, that's a very powerful indicator of closeness. So there doesn't seem to be any hostility or separation between them. In my mind, the people we were with, now with is an indicator of conflict. So we do have conflict. It's just not with John O'Keefe. The conflict that she's feeling is with the people that they were with. Now, she says, middle-aged adults with children. So conflict, again, with the children. Some of the children were with us. So she restates that the children and then puts in with again. So there's a lot of conflict with the people that they were with us that night at the bar. It did not cross my mind for several days that they did this to John. Okay, did not. Again, uncontracted denial. If this is the first time that she's said this, then we would expect this to be a contraction. This is definitely not the first time she said this. This is actually in the second interview. She's had to answer this question so many times now that the extreme emphasis here is not surprising. So, I mean, I'm going to call Karen Reed out for deception when there's deception. An uncontracted denial, we have to be careful with that. It's not as telling as never with the word would. That combination of those two, that's deception. But when you have something like an uncontracted denial, you have to be careful not to overemphasize that because it has to be in the right context in order to be deception. And this is not the right context. So it did not cross my mind for several days. Now, this is important because she tells you right here, that for at least several, usually means 4. So at least 4 days, she believed that she had hit John O'Keefe. So now we know that definitively because she says it, that they did this to John. So we have doubling up of the word they. She knows that not all of them were involved. So it's hard to use a generic they were involved when she's including all the kids and everything. So some of they did, some of they didn't. So it's a problematic word for her to say, and you see that here. That John was treated like a piece of garbage. These were women and men. Remember, when you list things, you put the higher priority people on the list first. And so she prioritized saying women first. That tells me that she knows that there were women involved in this. And that is interesting because Karen Reed has had access to all of the evidence up to this point, and the way that everything has been coming out in the trial would lead me to believe that Jen McCabe, she knew about it. But to say that Jen McCabe had an active role in this would be questionable based on what I know at this point. Only because when she Googled how long does it take, Brian Albert could have just called her and said, Google this for me, or somehow gotten that message to her or picked up her phone or who knows. So at this point, I didn't really have any real indication that women were involved in this until right here. So these were women and men. Some I knew better than others that I knew. This is interesting. She says knew here. Most people here would say some I knew better than others that I thought to be normal people, right? That would be an indicator that at that time you thought that they were normal people. When Karen Reed uses the word knew, she's telling you that in that moment, she liked those people. She's not telling you that she didn't really know back then, but she knows now that they were bad people. She's telling you that in that moment, she felt that those were good people, not that they were bad people. And so that's important because, well, for one thing, she's telling you that is what is the reason why she thought she hit him, because she felt that she was with good people. And then when she says that I knew to be normal people, now she stumbles over the word normal here because knew is the correct word. She knew them to be normal in that moment, but now in the present, she knows that they're not normal people. And so normal is the wrong word, but she's emphasizing very heavily that in that moment, it never crossed her mind that based on anything that she knew about those people that she was with, that they would have been involved in this. That's what she's telling you. And I went through every possibility. He was near the road and he was dying. And I didn't think he was purposefully put in that place. So she uses I means high sensitivity here. And what she is about to tell you is she didn't think that John O'Keefe was put there by them. in that moment. And that's hard to say because I hesitate to say it like this, but a simpleton who's not willing to look at all of the information, who's not willing to understand the complex emotional process that is going on here, is going to simply say, when she says that she thought that she hit them and that she didn't think he was purposefully put in that place, most people who want to hear that she's guilty are going to take a statement like this and say, look, she's guilty, even though that's absolutely not what she's saying. So it makes it hard to say something that you know people are going to misinterpret. So that's normal. So what do we get from this answer? We know that at the time of the murder, she still felt close to John O'Keefe. And as she felt for several days, based on what she knew of the people there, that the most likely scenario, that it would be her fault. That's what she thought. And to think that, again, goes back to drinking. If you would think that the most likely scenario there is that it's your fault, she would have had to have been pretty seriously intoxicated to have that belief and not know. All right, next question here. Now,
How soon was it when you pulled in there that you saw John's body?
Immediately. And what struck me when I saw him was his mouth was open a little bit and his eyes were shut and he had spots of blood in different areas on his face.
Now, this is an interesting question. This is after the murder. So how soon was it when you pulled in there that you saw John's body? And she says, immediately. And what struck me when I saw him was his mouth was open a little bit and his eyes were shut. And he had spots of blood in different areas on his face. Now, think about this for a second. This is after the murder. There's not a single indicator of deception in here. She is very comfortable telling you the exact truth. The first thing that comes to the top of her head after the murder. People who are guilty, who know that they're guilty at this point, are going to manipulate this information. Karen Reed added information during that questionable part when she was drunk and she didn't trust her own senses in what happened that night. But the next morning, she's crystal clear and she's not afraid to tell you exactly what happened. So the part that I want to emphasize here is that this is a classic gotcha question for a good interrogator to ask something that seems benign, a question that seems benign after the fact. That a guilty person is often going to tell you what they see and then they're going to add in information. They're going to add in extra details that are going to, in their mind, make it more difficult for you to think that they had done it. So a guilty person is going to be working on their defense from the time of the murder until infinity after that. And Karen Reed is not doing that here. So that's a strong indicator of truthfulness here. Now, we'll move on to this question. This is a question that I left you with at the end of the last video. So let's look at this question again. I'm going to show you so you can hear it from them, how it was in the interview, and then let's analyze this.
Supporters swarmed around Karen Reed, charged with murder in the January 2022 death of her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe. Reed has strenuously denied the allegations.
I did not kill John O'Keefe. I've never harmed a hair on John O'Keefe's head.
All right. Karen Reed charged with murder in the January 2022 death of her boyfriend, Boston police officer John O'Keefe. Reed has strenuously denied the allegations. So the reason why I'm rereading what I played for you is because I want you to see that in the question, if this was the first time that she was asked, or if it was at the very beginning of the interview, they would have said, Reed strenuously denied the allegation. But that's not what they said. So we need to look at what they meant by what they said. Reed has strenuously denied the allegations. So that is very purposefully plural, which tells us that she's been asked this more than once. So the uncontracted denial makes sense. So I did not kill John O'Keefe. I've never harmed a hair on John O'Keefe's head. Okay, we have a bunch of other things that we got to look at here and put all these things into context. So the phrase harmed a hair on someone's head is not a literal phrase. That's problematic when we're analyzing it for deception, because if there's other indicators of deception, is it still deception if she's talking about harming a hair on his head? So is she saying that she's never harmed John O'Keefe? Because what she was doing with Brian Higgins definitely was harming John O'Keefe. So this whole added on statement is problematic. She knows very well that she was not a good girlfriend. And she knows that the way that she was acting with Brian Higgins was harming John O'Keefe. Now, she's trying to insinuate, the insinuation here is that she never caused John O'Keefe physical harm. But that's not what she says. And so we see deception here. Now we need to ask, what are we trying to learn? We're trying to learn, did she kill John O'Keefe? does this, only the second sentence here, because we know the reason for the uncontracted denial, but now we need to make sense out of the second sentence. I've never harmed a hair on John O'Keefe's head. The best that I can tell you here is that she most likely feels guilt for the way that she was treating John O'Keefe. And to use a generic phrase that implies physical harm but can still mean emotional harm is too generic. And so she's not going to have any commitment to that phrase. And you don't see any commitment. So that phrase is meaningless. It doesn't mean that she harmed him, even though we know that she did emotionally. It also doesn't mean that she harmed him physically, and it doesn't mean that she didn't. It just doesn't mean anything. So we don't get anything from that. Now, the last thing that I do want to look at is use of John O'Keefe's full name. She says, I did not kill John O'Keefe. Here, she doesn't call him John. She calls him John in literally the answer to every other question. The questions that are before the murder, that are very close to the time of the murder, that are right after the murder, it's always John. And so when she says John O'Keefe, the difference that she's seeing in that moment is John O'Keefe, the murder victim, versus John O'Keefe, the person. In her mind, she is thinking of John O'Keefe as the murder victim here and not as the John O'Keefe that she was dating. That's why she calls him something different. As an interrogator, what I would have liked to have seen here would be this question set up. So you see the questions leading up to it that have no accusatory tone to them whatsoever. And then the first accusatory question should come a little bit out of the blue. You want to try and catch that person off guard because you want to see if they get that deer in headlights look or if they get instantly angry. And so because we don't know that, all evidence here leads to this question being led up to by a bunch of other aggressive questions, which causes this type of response. The bottom line is I hope I've given you enough information to understand why I can't get any information from this. If I was just to give you my personal opinion here, is I think they aggressively led into this question, and that this here is a statement that Karen Reed feels guilt for the way that she treated John O'Keefe, that she's insinuating that she didn't hit him. She's not 100% sure, or at least at the time she wasn't 100% sure. But based on the evidence that she's seen, she doesn't believe that she did. And this is the best she can come up with on the spot, is a very non-committal statement. And the reason why you're seeing John O'Keefe's full name here is because most likely the person asking the question very specifically put John O'Keefe into the category of murder victim. And that is a hard pill for somebody in a relationship to swallow. So if she is going to mentally separate the John O'Keefe that she knew, the John that she knew, with the John O'Keefe, the murder victim, I would expect to see that here. So the bottom line is, this doesn't tell us anything. It was good for me to leave you on a cliffhanger on the last video, but in the end, it actually doesn't say anything. So now I had difficulty putting all the puzzle pieces together here. There was a piece of information that didn't fit right. And that is, if you remember the story that I told you in the first video about Sarah and Emily dies because she gets hit by a tree branch, and Sarah feels guilt for that. It is very possible for someone to feel responsible and feel guilt for another person's death. The missing link there for me for a long time was, in order to feel that, there has to be love. There has to be a love connection. There has to be a serious bond there. And it's very clear that Karen Reed was not in love with John O'Keefe. And that prevented all the puzzle pieces from coming together for me for a long time. None of this makes sense because the physical evidence, everything that she says, everything, it just doesn't all fit together until you can figure out that last piece. And over the weeks that I was analyzing this statement, I was looking in the wrong place. I was looking in the questions that are specifically about the murder. And as I was going through everything again, I hit this question and it dawned on me why this question is so important. So before we analyze this question, we got to answer that question about love. And that's what this is going to address. But love is kind of a sketchy word. We want to define that before we go into this. So there's an influencer that I watch on Instagram, and I'm going to play one of her shorts for you because I think it's very profound. It's one thing to know something and to have these nebulous thoughts that are difficult to put words to, but when somebody puts words to it the right way, it really brings everything together. And I really think that this really does that. It did for me. Might not resonate for you, but I like the meaning of this, so I'm going to play this for you.
Always remember this one. When a human being truly loves you, their biggest fear is to hurt you. But when a human being is in love with how you make them feel, their biggest fear is to lose you. And then there is you, and understanding the difference.
Okay, so what she's saying in there is that love is about caring more about the well-being of the person that you love than about the way that person makes you feel. That's selfish. That's loving yourself more than the other person. When somebody else makes you feel good about yourself and you're afraid to lose that person, that's not love. And it's important to understand when you define love that way as caring for the well-being of another person, it's going to make a lot of sense putting this question into context here. So let's look at the question. All right. So the question again was, John's niece and nephew, who he was taking care of, essentially testified against you in the trial. How hard was that? It seems like such a benign question. And this question doesn't answer the question of, did you murder John O'Keefe? But this gives us such a pivotal piece of information here. Let me show you.
John's niece and nephew, who he was taking care of, essentially testified against you in the trial. How hard was that?
I knew that was coming because I read what they testified to in the initial indictment almost 3 years ago. And they're part of a well that was poisoned almost as soon as he died. And they were 3 years younger then and impressionable and surrounded by adults that care for them and provide for them. And I was no longer one of those adults. And it's unfortunate, and I hope and wish for the best for them, but I've long come to terms with what's happened to the children.
I knew that was coming because I read what they testified to in the initial indictment almost 3 years ago. Okay, there's a lot of sensitivity here. Deception. She says she knew what was coming. Now, because this is deceptive, I can tell you she didn't know what was coming. She did read it, but she had no idea what was coming. Maybe because she felt like even though they said that behind closed doors, that when it came time to show up in court, she was expecting them to reflect the relationship that they had. And she was clearly tore up about that. So she's pretending like she's strong and she was prepared for this, but you're going to see here that this destroyed her. So she wasn't prepared for it. What they testified to in the initial indictment almost 3 years ago, and they're part of a well that was poisoned almost as soon as he died. Okay, that's direct and straightforward, truthful. And they were 3 years younger then and impressionable and surrounded by adults that care for them and provide for them. And I was no longer one of those adults. Okay, that's all direct. So you see the deception in the beginning, and you see what that deception tells you is how much pain she went through hearing their testimony. And it's unfortunate. So that's interesting because you think that she's referring to the testimony, but she's referring to the sentence right before it. And I was no longer one of those adults, and it's unfortunate. So you see her reflecting. And while the insinuation is that the well being poisoned is what was unfortunate, the testimony was unfortunate, it was unfortunate, but you see she stumbles on it's because it refers not just to what she's insinuating, but I was no longer one of those adults. And it's unfortunate, meaning she had a very strong tie to those kids. And I hope and wish the best for them. So that's not deception. I with Karen Reed, especially because she does it a lot. That's very high sensitivity. I hope and wish for the best for them. This is a struggle for her. And I've long come to terms with what's happened to the children. I have. That's a repeating pronoun here along with the verb. So I have long come to terms with what's happened to the children. She has not come to terms with that. So this is a statement that really gives you a glimpse into what ties all of this together. The love that Karen Reed had that created all of this guilt was for the kids, not for John O'Keefe. She's tore up here, and it comes across very clearly in her answer. And so now you can fit all the puzzle pieces together. In fact, let's begin that process. Let's take everything that we've learned. That's the last question we're going to look at. So let's recap this so that we have a very clear idea of what we know about Karen Reed here. Karen Reed wants to portray an image of strength, but in reality, she has been deeply hurt throughout this entire process, mainly by the children turning against her, but also by negativity from the public. We learned that because of the indicators of deception when she was trying to put a strong foot forward. Karen Reed loved the children, not John O'Keefe. Okay, we got that from the last question. Karen Reed made poor decisions regarding how much she drank that night, and that still haunts her as being a bad decision. We know that the scientific evidence of Karen Reed not hitting John O'Keefe is clear because of the federal investigators from the ARCA investigation that was withheld from the first trial. We know that Karen Reed's vehicle did not hit John O'Keefe, and John O'Keefe wasn't hit by a vehicle. We know that Karen Reed felt responsible for John O'Keefe's death for at least the first 3 or 4 days. She told you that. Her perception was that it must have been her. There's a couple of things that go into that. That number one, she doesn't say that she thought she hit him. She says she thought that that was the most likely scenario. And that's because of how much she drank, that she didn't actually remember that very well. And so she feels that even though she didn't hit John O'Keefe and she's not in any way responsible for his death, due to the state that she was in that night and the decisions that she made, it could just as easily have been her fault. That's important. She dodged a bullet, so to speak. For someone like Karen Reed, who, I mean, if you look at her background, the job that she had, the education that she has, the way she tries to present herself, portraying herself as a responsible adult, as a responsible individual is very important to Karen Reed. The way Karen Reed is perceived by people around her is very important to her. She wants to be responsible. She wants people to look up to her. She's educated. She had a good job. All that stuff is very important to her. So when she looks back on that evening and thinks, wow, I made a bad decision with how much I drank and then drove, got in the car, put myself into a situation where that could have just as easily been my fault. That's the bottom line, is that it wasn't her fault, but she feels like it could have been. In fact, for 4 days, she felt that it was her fault only because she underestimated the nefarious personalities of the people around her. But the idea in her mind that she'd made a series of decisions, that she was one of those people that make those types of bad decisions, that put her into a situation where it could have been. If he hadn't been murdered, if he had walked behind or in front of her SUV, she could have been the one that ran over him and not even known it because of the state she was in. That is weighing on her. That is heavy on her mind. So Karen Reed is logically very clear on what happened that night. She's been studying it for 3 years. Why is she studying it so hard? Because she's trying to prove to herself that she didn't hit him. And it's very clear. There's a ton of physical evidence that says she didn't do it. There's a ton of witness testimony from the witnesses that testified against her that they did do it. So she has a very clear storyline laid out in front of her of what actually happened. The problem is that she doesn't really remember it all that well. What's weighing on her mind is the bad decisions that she made that night. Okay, so my personal opinion, based on all the evidence, based on all the testimony, based on all the analysis, what do I think happened? Karen Reed didn't hit John O'Keefe. She knows that logically, and all of the evidence supports that. However, she made bad decisions that night, and those bad decisions caused her to put herself into a situation where she was not the responsible adult in the room. And that grinds against everything that is important to her. Also, she feels that if she had made the responsible decision to tell John O'Keefe, you're going home tonight. I don't care if this ends our relationship. You're going home tonight. You're not going out with them, no matter how badly you want to go out with them. She could have made the decision to drive home. She could have made the decision not to go out that night. There's a lot of decisions she could have made that would have prevented all of this. And in the end, I think that what she feels the most guilt about and the most responsibility for is the life that John O'Keefe's niece and nephew are going to live now without parents and without their uncle and without her. I think she felt that she was the only responsible person that was mothering them. That is what creates this intense sense of guilt and feeling responsible for this. And it's going to be hard for anybody to convince her otherwise, because while John O'Keefe is at rest now, his niece and nephew are not. They're continuing to suffer. And I think that weighs on Karen Reed. So that is my analysis. Let me know what you think. There's a lot to take in here, but I think that once you understand the deception, the indicators of truth, the story and the evidence, and put everything together, in the end, what this tells you is that Karen Reed is not the main character in this story. If the main character that we're talking about is the villain, then the main character is we're yet to get a trial on that. The last thing I want to say is what the Commonwealth is doing to Karen Reed, clearly knowing they have the evidence. They have decided for some reason to persecute her, knowing that she didn't do it. It's either lazy or malicious. But either way, to make the conscious decision to destroy the life of somebody who's already suffering from this is insane. It doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, other than protecting their own, which if a person decides they're going to protect their own, they'll go to the grave to do that. But I don't know, the damage that they're doing in order to try to cover this up. I can Karen Reed through this emotional turmoil. I mean, if I was doing that to somebody when I was working, that would have been considered torture. But for some reason, they seem to be getting away with it. But that's it. That's my personal opinion that I added on to the very end there. But, I feel like I've earned it after doing all the analysis. All right. All that being said, keep watching my videos. Keep learning how to do this for yourself. Don't rely on other people to tell you if somebody's innocent or guilty. Don't rely on your gut feeling. Use the information that you have at your fingertips. Figure out if people are lying or telling the truth. And if they're lying, what are they lying about and why are they lying about it? And keep in mind that people's perceptions of things influence their reality, what they remember their reality to be. So keep that in mind. Really good deception detection is really good pattern recognition, being able to recognize what you see over and over again in different responses to different questions or open statements. All right, this is Truth Revealed signing off, and I will see you next time.